Everyone, and welcome back. In this lecture we'll continue our discussion of cluster maps. In the previous lecture we looked at cluster maps and we saw that by calling the cluster map function that Seaborn has, we are able to draw a cluster map. So SNS.clustermap, and we used our flights dataset, and let's pass the color map attribute and set it to cool warm. We also saw that we can pass the line width attribute to separate each of the cluster from another cluster. Let's set it to 1.2 and let's run this. So here we have a cluster map clustered by year and month, and we have our key here. Another thing we can do is we can adjust the size of our cluster by passing the figure size attribute. Let's see an example. So if I paste this here, run it, so this is the default size, and let's pass the fig size attribute, and let's try 6 by 4. We can adjust it by passing different values. It's much smaller. Let's try 8 by 6. That looks like a nice figure size, so we don't have to scroll up and down to see the entire cluster map. I think we can go a bit larger. Let's try 9 by 7. So that's nice. So you can adjust this to a size that fits your notebook very well. Great. Another thing we can do with cluster maps is standardize our flights data frame or data set, either by columns or rows. So to standardize our flights dataset across the columns or rows, we'll be using an attribute known as the standard scale. Okay, so let's see how we can do that. Standardize across columns or rows. Let's see how we can do that. So as usual, we call the cluster map method or function, and then we'll pass our flights dataset, and we'll pass another attribute known as standard scale, standard_scale, and this standard scale attribute takes the value of either 0 or 1. So a value of 0 means it will standardize the flights dataset across rows, whereas a value of 1 will standardize our data across columns. Let's first see a standard scale of 1. This means it will standardize our flights dataset across columns. Let's run it. Okay, so that's what it looks like. And if we want to standardize our flights dataset across rows, we'll pass a value of 0 for our standard scale attribute. Let me paste it here and pass a standard scale value of 0. Run it, and now we have our cluster map standardized by row versus columns in the above cluster map here. We can also normalize our flights dataset by passing another attribute known as the z-score. So this time we'll see normalizing our dataset. For that we'll pass an attribute known as z-score. So you can check out what z-score is on Google. I'll show you how we can normalize our flights dataset by passing this score. Similar to the standard scale attribute, the z-score attribute takes the value of either 0 or 1. So 0 is to normalize our data across rows, whereas 1 is to normalize across columns. So this is for rows, whereas 1 is to normalize our data across columns. So we start by calling the Clustermap function, and then we'll pass our flights dataset, and the attribute is called z_score, z-score. Let's pass a value of 0. So this will normalize our data across the rows. Okay, we have that. And to normalize our data across the columns, we'll have to pass a z-score value of 1. So sns.clustermap, and we'll pass our flights dataset, and for the z-score attribute we'll pass a value of 1. Now our dataset is normalized across the columns, right? So this is what I have for the lecture on cluster maps. Just to summarize, we saw that we can call Seaborn's cluster map method or function to cluster our data across the rows and columns, and we can pass the column cluster or the row cluster attributes if we want to cluster our dataset either by columns or rows only. We also saw that we could change the color of our cluster map by passing the color map attribute, and we can pass the line width attribute to separate each cluster from the other. And we also looked at how we can change the size of our cluster map by passing the fixed size attribute. And finally, we looked at how we can standardize and normalize our cluster map across columns and rows by passing values of 0 or 1. Great. Thank you everyone, and